This podcast begins a discussion of the Political Organizers Service Group. It is the first of 3 separate podcasts, and due to time and complexity of this subject, it is in outline form. It is summarized as to the major topics, some of which are crisis, international consciousness, leadership, statesmanship, ideal government, new vision for humanity, nature of power and authority, cultivating the scenario of peace, and implementing the will to good, and much more. I will not be talking about specific individuals, leaders, or nations, but presenting ideas and ideals on what may be in the political field from a spiritual but not religious perspective. I'm hoping this will broaden your perspective on how you see the world and its potential. Remember, for comprehending the essence of these talks on the evolutionary service groups, my purpose is to impart a kernel of spiritual potential for transforming humanity into a brighter, wiser, loving, secure, and sustainable future. As you will see, there are already people and groups influencing the political services group, but needless to say, there's much to do. The concepts and ideas discussed can be applied to individual members of any of the evolutionary service groups. Also paralleling these podcasts on the political services group and our other supplemental podcast on synthesis and group integration and visualizing the new civilization. So let's begin. In essence, the political organizers service group deals with problems of political and social order within civilization and the relationships existing between communities and nations. In today's world, it is arguably the most important of the evolutionary service groups, as it works in collaboration with a number of people and other service groups to achieve common ends for the benefit of the greater group humanity. This service group influences humanity through public administration and providing leadership for direction of the community or the nation. Political Organizers Service Group goal is to bring about an international awareness for demonstrating how the divine will works out in consciousness of the races and nations. The Tibetan master Dwokul describes them as organizers, inferring that workers in this group will facilitate right organization of society through the expression of the will. The spiritual hierarchy of masters impresses the energy of will mainly with group energy under the laws of service and group progress. They understand that unless there is an underlying energy of love and wisdom and the energy of synthesis, the will energy becomes a destroyer and obviously can cause problems on the physical plane. It is only until the mid-20th century that the destroyer aspect of the development of the atomic bomb, for example, that mankind realized its power. Since then, man is learning the wisdom of its use as a major deterrent to crisis and the need to diffuse it. Overall, the Political Organizers Group is mostly involved with intuiting ideas on how governments of the world can function free from illusion of power, authority, and ambition. Members of this group must be able to work with ideas and be capable of defining the best forward-thinking ideas for advancing humanity's spiritual progress. They can do this through hierarchical impression by receiving the idea or the thought form where it is then telepathically sent to politicians. Politicians are thinking, and also we can also think about the telepathic communicators group, which are also communicating with the political organizers, and they're holding the thought form of receiving the idea, and they can adapt this into higher ideas and policy. Therefore, this group carries with it a certain authority or will that other service groups do not have. This authority helps to bring about international understanding and unity between nations. The spiritual hierarchy oversees government, civilization for humanity. They provide a higher inspired pattern of the plan, the spiritual plan, God's plan, to be imposed upon the planes of consciousness where humanity resides for bringing about change within civilization. Obviously, this requires much wisdom on their part, as impressions must always be impersonal and allow mankind to retain free will. When members of the political organizers group impose their will, Often there is friction and destruction as old personality-oriented ways resist change. This is most evident when extreme views from different political parties are vying for power and want to subvert human free will. Many of the ideas to change may be timely for humanity, but the organizers must also consider practical questions existing on the physical plane. They have their own requirements to be honored if excessive and unnecessary destruction is to be avoided. We have seen examples of this from numerous movements that have happened in the last 100 years, such as implementing civil rights for minorities and the cause of women's suffrage. Both movements resulted in great change in consciousness in society and on occasion destruction through violence and loss of life. From these and other impressed changes from the spiritual hierarchy will come a different mental orientation, where humanity will become aware that they, together with the one humanity, regardless of nation, race, or language, will come together. The political organizers do not work with the physical plane alone. Their higher work is to influence the consciousness of races and nations. They understand that energies of the heart must merge with the higher mind of the soul in order for the divine will to work out itself in consciousness. With the energies of synthesis, international unity will come about between groups of nations through practice, cooperation, and goodwill. This requires an impersonal approach as they move away from the needs of the individual group or nation to that of the needs of the larger group, humanity. The political organizers will work subjectively within the departments of government for the gradual improvement of the relations between nations. Their work will emphasize statesmanship and rising above partisanship for representing the higher ideal dedicated to the welfare of its citizens. Success of this group depends on the educational work of the organizers, that is, the educators of the New Age service group, presents humanity with a vision of mutual trust, goodwill, and a brotherhood of nations based on a common goals, needs, and tolerance and goodwill. An embryonic form of this brotherhood already exists through the United Nations. However, in today's world, the UN functions mostly with rivalry and mistrust rather than goodwill and right human relations. Despite the problems of the UN, it provides a significant thought form of cooperation and mutual interrelationship that is a model for enabling cooperation and goodwill for the future. So let's turn now about what we're calling the crisis of perception. For generations, humanity has been developing through all the service groups. Although great scientific, economic, and political success has ensued, it has come at a great expense to humanity and the planet. Because our global problems are so acute, we have reached a crisis of perception. This is a phrase that the physicist Fritjof Capra defined in the 1980s, saying that we have many crises, but in reality there's only one crisis. Our model, according to Capra, is that we are trying to apply concepts to an outdated worldview. We now realize as individuals, as a group of nations, that we are living systems existing within other systems and therefore influence each other. Our challenge is to learn how we can integrate cooperatively with other groups, nations, and the environment to share a common vision and realize how we as humanity connect with and influence other people and things. This can lead to a world unifying vision that embraces all peoples and all nations and cultures. The political organizers group seems best suited for creating a new vision, for defining a foundation, for shared vision for humanity. And this will require people like statespersons and visionary leaders to come forward. From an esoteric teachings standpoint, we understand that the path of human spiritual growth evolves over lifetimes from the individual with separative and selfish tendencies towards group awareness, cooperation, sharing, and unity or oneness. Let's now talk about working with crisis. Looking back in world history right up until today, the everyday person wants to find peace in their lives. But the reality, a large portion of humanity lives in near constant crisis. For this discussion, crisis we will define as a decisive point or situation in consciousness where conflict reaches its highest tension and must be resolved through expanded awareness. Much of the work at the heart of the political organizers group is about crisis management. This can be mitigating crises, whether local, national, or internationally based. Every single human being has been exposed to some form of crisis in his or her life, be it mental, emotional, or the physical levels. So we all know what it's like. Fortunately, we are not in this continually, otherwise not much would be accomplished in our lives or in the world. So we are continually confronted with the question, do we have the courage to face challenges that upend our normal routine? Many people bury their emotional pain and want to get through a crisis as soon as possible. This is natural, as nobody wants to dwell in pain and suffering, but as we know, crisis must eventually be faced and there must be a means for moving through it. For this point, we will describe how an individual with a relative spiritual connection with his or her soul deals with crisis, esoterically understood, to finally arrive at awareness and revelation with expanded consciousness for considering another way forward. For this individual, perhaps a leader and member of the political organizers group and who is relatively awake in a spiritual sense, when he or she is in crisis, his consciousness is actually experiencing the crisis as a series of conflicting thought forms or energies as in a crucible. Esoterically, we call this a burning ground through the fire of mind. He may feel stress and tension or even fear, but in order to move past and expand his consciousness, he'll have to willfully take the energy and remake it with love, compassion, inclusiveness, acceptance, and awareness in his consciousness. When he has successfully done this, he will have dissipated and transformed its power into something more life-giving, and will have brought a wholeness to himself. Thus, his awareness and vision expands. For the political organizers group, crises and unresolved problems abound everywhere. In today's world, there are many clear and defined problems. For example, gun violence, corruption, denial of voting rights to everyone, and climate change-related legislation, to name a few. If you are coming from a space of cooperation and goodwill, problems such as these can be resolved relatively easily, as all parties involved would theoretically want to resolve the problem, cooperate, and help anyone who could be harmed. But as we know, the facts speak a different story. Many factions, such as lobbyists and many legislators, may debate an issue, but does not resolve it, as their interests are focused only in what it is in it for them, and not what is best for the community or people in general. So the issue or issues persist and remain unresolved. Referring back to the major issues facing a nation or humanity, the individual politician or legislator, as aspirant or disciple, spiritually speaking, must also confront and deal with the conflicting energies or forces in consciousness. The reality there are many people that are offering positive, forward-thinking solutions to pressing problems of humanity is facing. They are mostly blocked by the forces, usually materialistic and narrow-minded individuals whose interests only benefit them and not the greater group in need. For this, they need to apply wisdom and confront the dark or separative thoughts firmly and want to block the higher need for the community, nation, or humanity. A spiritual focused leader would allow a positive ability for demonstrating a synthesis for all related activities so they can work out. For example, activities could be rallying people for mitigating the effects of climate change and protecting the environment for future generations. This is one example of projects that can be directly aid a nation or humanity. We can also think of the community or the nation as like a disciple or spiritual disciple who is moving forward, going through crisis and his change in his consciousness. The example here could be having a national conversation about voting rights for everyone and how legislation to control guns would be a benefit to everyone. Everyone who is immersed in the crisis and seeking resolution to these problems are also subject to the change and transformation to their own individual consciousness. We note that during crisis, when the soul impulses through impression its intention to the separative or unknowing personality, it is wanting to master its lower reflection at the mental, emotional, and physical levels. The results are a purification and transformation, which results in greater awareness and illumination on the issues at hand. When speaking of crisis for the spiritually aware individual or the leader of a nation, for example, this evokes a wise application of love, higher reasoning, and the spiritual will into your service work. We saw this through the programs of the New Deal instituted by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s during the Depression. Through the working out of these programs, which are actual thought forms put into action, these developed a knowingness by the people implementing them. This resulted in dissipating or neutralizing the illusion of depression and economic instability in people's minds. This thought form of activity in action then became part of a national conversation and resulted in bringing understanding at the national level. With these dynamics in mind, Franklin Roosevelt understood how these programs contributed toward achieving expanded awareness for the nation. So what makes a person a leader? In the context of the political organizer service group, leaders exist in all nations, at the civic level all the way up to president or prime minister of a nation. The Google definition of a leader is a person that leads, rules, or inspires others. We also see that a leader can be the head of a family, a manager of a corporation, a leader in industry, or a leader of a nation who can grasp a situation or a project and make it turn out the way he or she wants. Through this position, the leader is generally seen as responsible and one whom others can follow. This characterizes the vast majority of political leaders around the world. But let's note, this description says nothing of the ethics, morality, and vision which this individual may or may not have. A ruthless and corrupt dictator is also a leader, but is lacking morality and ethics. From an esoteric viewpoint, the question to ask, is the individual motivated by higher ethics, such as influence from the soul and possessing long-range vision, and not motivated by personal ambition? In most ways, this involves the spiritual guided individual broadening his vision and service work into a greater global context. In the Alice Bailey book, Discipleship in the New Age, Volume 1, she talked about world discipleship. A man becomes a world disciple in a technical sense when the vision is to him as important and determining fact in his consciousness, and one to which of all his daily efforts are subordinated. He needs no one to reveal the plan to him. He knows. His sense of proportion is adjusted to the revelation of his life and is dedicated to bring the vision into factual existence. So let's talk a little bit about some of the words used here, like world disciple and discipled. The Google definition of a disciple is a follower of Jesus. Our definition here is not related to any religion, but a follower has the vision and a philosophy of how humanity can thrive, which may embrace teachings from various sources. The term world discipleship in this context is the idea that education should teach the individual about citizenship, not only know about political or governmental processes, but to understand and develop a sense of synthesis in how people can cooperatively work with members of other service groups regardless of nation or culture. Service workers are driven by a finer set of values such as cooperation, goodwill, synthesis, and working with a sense of divine indifference and consecration toward implementing the spiritual plan or God's plan. So let's talk about what a statesman is or a visionary leader. Otto von Bismarck, the statesman from the 19th century, said, "The statesman's task is to hear God's footsteps marching through history and to try to catch on to his coattails as he marches past." An online dictionary defines the term statesman as a person who is experienced in the art of government or versed in administration of government affairs. Another definition is a person who expresses great wisdom and ability in directing the affairs of government or in dealing with important public issues. History shows that governments have typically been set up with an individual at the top who sets the tone and agenda for his or her nation, irrespective of the type of government. Many of them are administrators or caretakers, but few are statesmen. What makes a person a statesman? From an esoteric viewpoint, a true statesman is a leader who would most likely be able to simultaneously see the big picture or have a vision of the plan, God's plan, and how their country fits in. He or she would use intelligence and the will for enacting great change within society and possibly all civilization. Examples of statesmen we've had in history in the last 160 years or so is Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Malala in current times, Mikhail Gorbachev, Golda Meir, Nelson Mandela, Dr. Martin Luther King, and John F. Kennedy. In the 1860s, Lincoln held the vision of the United States as unified and not separated. He did all he could to preserve the unity, and after 4 years of civil war and hundreds of thousands of lives lost, he prevailed. In the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev, as the leader of the former Soviet Union, saw his nation was suffering politically and economically at home and abroad from the continual waste of resources that were dedicated toward military expenditures and political ambition. By seeing the larger picture, both domestically and internationally, and the political trajectory his nation was on, he changed the focus within his government and reallocated those resources toward more useful, non-military, and life-giving purposes. His actions were predicated on the wisdom of seeing the long-term big picture. Dr. Martin Luther King had the ability of using rhetoric that spoke from a high-educated mind, but could also communicate in the words of the everyday man. Putting aside any utopian or idealistic visions, the statesman at the level of international relations works subjectively with soul energies of cooperation and goodwill and unity, and he senses his nation's part for achieving a gradual improvement in the relations between other nations. With an ability for seeing the big picture, this individual views humanity as moving towards a brotherhood of nations as an ideal. The statesman is not a savior, but someone who can envision the context of a problem and provide direction. We can consider characteristics such as demeanor of a statesman. A statesman of this caliber would undoubtedly have some awareness of the soul, his own sense of it at least, and he's group conscious and expressing the spirit of the soul and a vision of at the national level. He would have a clear idea of the future that can be achieved in stages. The statesman acts as a facilitator for enabling an immediate vision to naturally unfold. In practical stages for a long-term recovery, he would undoubtedly employ the energies of will and synthesis to bring together diverse forces from other service groups, or such as in politics, finance, culture, education, science, and religion, into a higher realization. In practical terms, the statesman, with his or her knowledge of government and its workings, make it work through legislation and allocating funds to make the vision become a reality on the physical plane. He would be able to work with the various existing service groups, such as the telepathic communicators who help to forge a new vision forward, the financial service group for stimulating the economy and making funds available, the trained observer service group, that is, the broadcast journalists, the talking heads, who will interview people and discuss elements of the new vision and expanding on what it means for the nation and civilization as a whole. Publicly, he or she would be able to communicate ideas for the need of a new story or vision of how we're connected, we can cooperate, and how we are interrelated and working together and not apart amongst communities, ethnic groups, races, and interacting with the environment. The statesperson would describe a future that engages people's deep spiritual needs by rallying people around a particular cause and creates a coherent group of knowledge and wisdom. It also follows that the statesman would be motivated by his or her own core values such as cooperation, non-separatism, and goodwill, and that his leadership model is based on a firm ethical foundation. With his combined skills and experience, it underscores the idea of the necessity for rising above partisanship and separatism and the limitations of nationalism, and by representing the higher ideal as a concept dedicated to the welfare of its citizens from now and into the future. Although great progress has been made toward world unity, the energy of will and mental powers are still largely focused on the inner and outer planes toward selfish and destructive ends, such as currently exist with Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, and Syria, or any nation that it sows division between other nations. Here in the United States, the selfish expression of the will is focused through legislative leaders whose interests and allegiance are only toward conservative or liberal values. Both parties and leaders are only looking toward their base and the next election and not the nation or the people that they are supposed to serve. Because of this mindset, conservative versus liberal values, with very, very little is left in the middle for compromise on national problems of immigration, repair of infrastructure, and educational reform, to name a few, and these all become stalled. It would seem that a clear line of cleavage or demarcation is crystallizing, as both sides are quite entrenched with their own political philosophies. As a result, the frequent calls for bipartisanship and cooperation between parties represents a strong energy of separatism, which is currently existing here in America in the U.S. political system. The same separatism we can also describe can also be seen in governments in Asia and Europe. One could also say this is a clash between the old me-only consciousness aligned with the forces of materialism and with the incoming energies representing by the principle of sharing, cooperation, and group consciousness. Internationally, there seems to be a vacuum of statesmen or women and leadership on the world stage that could provide a global vision. What nation or leaders see the higher vision of God's plan to help humanity move from a course bent on destruction to one of hope and plenty for all? Certain power-hungry individuals or personalities still rule in a number of countries around the world, such as in Russia, China, the Arab nations, and North Korea, as they are still holding on to the old mindsets of greed, engage in hate-mongering, and aggressive policies toward their neighbors. Since World War II, most nations have realized the severe consequences of war and destruction and its long-lasting effects on their nation and the world of nations. Consequently, a majority of nations have moved toward international unity and partnership through economic, political, and cultural sharing. So I'm going to close out this podcast, this first of 3 podcasts. We're talking about something called spiritual think tanks. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I just want to put this idea out there for you to think on and to possibly research. There's a number of organizations composed of leading evolutionary thinkers such as Greg Braden, Deepak Chopra, Barbara Marx Hubbard, who's now deceased, Jean Houston, and many others who are pooling their collective knowledge and wisdom to enable societal change and transformation on how statesmanship might act. 4 such organizations are the Center for Evolutionary Leadership. You can find this at evolutionaryleader.com. And they support social evolution through educational programs and leadership. Another institution is the Institute for Evolutionary Leadership. Their website is www.evoleadinstitute.com, evoleadinstitute.com. And their institute enables learning and collective action for systems transformation through educational programs and community-centered strategic initiatives. Another group is called Win Without War, and theirs is simply winwithoutwar.org. It's a network of activists and organizations working for a more peaceful, progressive U.S. foreign policy. And the fourth I'm referring to here is the Shift Network, which is theshiftnetwork.com, and they empower people on a journey of personal growth through media, education, and resources as an emerging culture to connect, collaborate, and cooperate using teachings of leading wisdom thinkers and visionaries. I also recommend 3 other supplemental podcasts that relate to this discussion. One is Synthesis, Group Integration, and Crisis. The second one is implementing creative solutions through visualization and right thought form building. And the other one is visualizing the new civilization.